Queens, New York. November 9th, 1998. The morning started like any other. Traffic on the Van Wyck. A gray sky that hadn't decided whether to rain. Somewhere along the way, a man stopped at an ATM, withdrew $600, and kept driving. He was supposed to report to a federal prison in New Jersey that day. He had been convicted of one of the largest bank fraud schemes in American history. $350 million, taken from multiple banks across 2 continents. Instead, he drove to John F. Kennedy Airport, left his car in long-term parking, and walked away. No dramatic escape, no confirmed alias, no final phone call. The question was never how John Ruffo stole $350 million. The question is how he disappeared, and why, after 27 years, no one has found him. John Ruffo did not look like someone who could steal $350 million. That was in many ways the point. He was born in Brooklyn in 1954, the son of a working-class Italian-American family. He earned a scholarship to New York University, studied computer science, and graduated into a city just beginning to understand what computers could do for business. He was not flashy. He wore thick-framed glasses, kept his head down, and built a reputation the slow way. In the early 1990s, he started his own company, Consolidated Computer Services, CCS, an IBM equipment reseller in New York City. Small operation, modest office. The kind of business that processed invoices and never made the news. What made CCS different was not what it sold. It was who ran it. By the time investigators began reconstructing the timeline, one detail kept returning. Ruffo had worked as an FBI informant. He understood, better than most, how institutions trusted people and how that trust could be used. The banks never knew any of that. But why did they believe him? It started with a conversation between 2 men who each had something the other needed. Edward Reiners had spent years as an executive at Philip Morris USA, and he had its letterhead, its internal language, and the weight its name carried in a room full of bankers. Then, he was laid off. The credentials remained. The paycheck did not. Ruffo had a functioning company, established banking relationships, and the infrastructure to move money through legitimate channels. What he lacked was a story large enough to unlock serious capital. In 1992, the 2 men found each other. What they built was almost elegant in its simplicity. They called it Project Star. Philip Morris was secretly developing a smokeless cigarette, so sensitive that the operation had to remain classified. CCS would provide the hardware and consulting. The banks would finance the leases. There was one condition. Because of the project's confidentiality, banks were required to sign agreements explicitly prohibiting them from contacting Philip Morris directly. The banks signed. Ruffo had obtained a Philip Morris executive's signature through a fabricated radio contest, a small deception to produce a single piece of paper. That paper, combined with Reiner's former title and forged documents, was enough. Signet Bank in Richmond wired the first funds. Then, another bank followed. Then, another. Ruffo took the money to Wall Street. He was not a skilled investor. What happens when the losses grow faster than the ability to cover them? For 3 years, the scheme worked, not because it was sophisticated, because no one looked. The confidentiality agreements had done their job, quietly, legally, with the full cooperation of every institution that signed them. The banks had accepted a clause that removed their most basic right as a lender, the right to verify. Because that clause was dressed in the language of corporate secrecy rather than evasion, no one in the approval chain flagged it as one unusual. Ruffo understood this. He had built the mechanism around a single assumption, that institutions trust their own processes more than they trust their instincts. He was right. To keep suspicion low, he made interest payments on time. Every quarter, the loans were serviced. On paper, CCS was a model borrower. Meanwhile, each losing position on Wall Street required a new loan to service the previous one. The cycle tightened. The exposure grew. By the mid-1990s, the total had crossed $350 million across multiple US and foreign institutions, none of which had ever spoken to each other about a company called CCS or a project called Project Star. The secrecy that protected the scheme from Philip Morris also protected it from the banks themselves. In compliance offices across 2 continents, the paperwork sat in folders, opened once a year, and closed again, without question. Then, in 1996, a foreign bank executive noticed something that did not align. He made a phone call. Who was supposed to catch this, and why did it take 3 years? The phone call moved quickly through the right channels. What investigators found was not a sophisticated financial architecture. It was forged papers held together by the assumption that no one would check. Project Star offices existed. The computers had been delivered, but the project itself had never existed at all. It was a name on a contract, nothing more. Ruffo and Reiners were arrested. The indictment ran to 150 counts. In October 1998, Ruffo entered a guilty plea and was sentenced to 17.5 years. Bail was set at $10 million. His family paid it. It was during the financial reconstruction, the document tracing, the office searches, that something else surfaced entirely. Inside the CCS offices, federal agents found a photograph. In it, John Ruffo stood beside the assistant director of the FBI's New York office, surrounded by the Bureau's own SWAT team. It was not a coincidence, and it was not a forgery. The FBI had formally contracted Ruffo and CCS in the early 1990s. Agents placed inside, operations running through its address, its phone lines, as part of an effort to track Soviet intelligence activity in New York. The Bureau had not told the US Marshals any of this. The Marshals found out while investigating the man they were now supposed to be hunting. On November 9, 1998, Ruffo rented a Ford Taurus, drove to Queens, returned his ankle monitor, and stopped at an ATM. $600. The camera recorded his face in the gray morning light, the last confirmed image that exists. He left the car in long-term parking at JFK and walked toward the terminal. No ticket under his name, no customs record, no confirmed departure. A man convicted of $350 million in bank fraud with international connections, intelligence ties, and a decade inside the federal system, had been trusted to drive himself to prison. No escort, no supervision. John von Ahnen, a former CCS employee, told ABC News that he believes to this day there has to be somebody in the FBI who helped him escape. The US Marshals said they could not rule it out. The Marshals opened a fugitive file before the week was out. Of the $350 million, approximately $13 million was never recovered. Reiners cooperated with investigators and eventually served his sentence. The Project Star offices were dismantled. The confidentiality agreements that had made it all possible were quietly noted in the case file. Ruffo's wife, Linda, was left behind without warning. In the months that followed, she found a set of addresses written in his hand, locations in Italy tucked inside the house. She turned them over to authorities. Nothing conclusive came of it. The Marshals placed Ruffo on their 15 most wanted list. He has not left it since. Investigators believe he is most likely living overseas under a constructed identity. It is also possible he never left at all, that a man with an ordinary face and no distinguishing features simply became someone else in a city large enough not to notice. But the photograph found inside CCS changes the shape of every theory. If the FBI built him, used him, and chose not to inform the Marshals of his history, then the question of who opened the door at JFK is no longer only about John Ruffo. Edward Reiners believes Ruffo is dead. Federal authorities do not. As of August 2024, His name remains on the Marshals' wanted page. The reward is $25,000. The age progression image shows a man in his late 60s, still unassuming, still unremarkable, still the most ordinary-looking person in the room. The $350 million is largely gone. The system that allowed it to move, quietly, confidentially, without a single phone call to verify, remained in place long after the last loan was filed. No one has seen John Ruffo since that gray morning at JFK. Or if they have, they didn't know who they were looking at.